Welcome to a Cloud Developer channel. Today we're going to cover the topic of ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework. The specific items we're going to do today are going to be creating a new ASP.NET Core application solution, creating a database project, creating a database with some dummy data, adding Entity Framework NuGet package to the database project. Then we're going to go ahead and create our first database model, set up ASP.NET Core to use the new database model, and then we're going to display the data from the database on our index page of the application. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and open up Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new ASP.NET web application using .NET Core. We're going to call this application context. And let's make sure we're using the right keyboard here. And hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and choose the authentication model to be Windows Authentication. And hit OK. It creates our new solution. And we're going to start off with adding another project to the solution, specifically to contain our database objects and classes that we're going to create. So we're going to select a class library, and we're going to call it context.db. This is a naming convention I typically like to use, which would be the name of the application itself or the solution, and then dot and the name of the layer. So in case of having business logic, you could call it context.businesslogic. In case of a database, I could call it data, or in this case I'm just going to go ahead and call it DB. And whatever the different naming conventions you would like to use, you can go ahead and do that here, as long as you do it consistently so you can replicate it between your applications. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And it by default creates a class1.cs file, and I'm going to go ahead and delete that from here. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and right click and add a new class that's going to represent our database context. And this is just a plain C# class, and we're going to call it context, and hit add. And it's going to add this file here. So I'm going to actually make it a public class because we're going to need to be able to access it in our main application. So it has to be publicly accessible. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to add a dependency, which is basically an entity framework for .NET Core. And you can do it in a few different ways. You can either right click on the dependencies within a given project and click Manage NuGet Packages, or you can right click on a solution and then Manage NuGet Packages for the solution. Now if you're doing this across multiple projects where you want to add a particular NuGet library, it's actually easier to do it at the solution level because it allows you to choose a specific project you want to add it to, especially if you want to do multiple. So here I'm going to go ahead and search for Entity Framework Core. And I'm going to look for something that has Entity Framework Core.SQL in the name. And the reason why we want to do that is because we're using a SQL database. So in here, you can actually find it right here. So and I go ahead and choose Entity Framework Core.SQL Server, and in this case I'm actually going to select both projects because we're going to need to be able to not only create a context in the model, but also we're going to need to be able to add specific setup logic in our main application to allow it to actually use the context and initiate a connection to the database. So I'm going to choose both projects and go ahead and click install here. It's going to go ahead and actually download all the dependencies and tell me what they are, and it's going to make sure that I agree to the changes that it's going to be making, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And here I have to accept the licensing terms from the different packages that are being imported. So I'm going to go ahead and hit accept and let it download. So it finished doing that process, and I'm gonna go ahead and close this, and I'll go ahead and save because it made some changes to some project files. Now, one thing I'll show you is actually when I tried to inherit a DB context class here, you'll notice that if I try to add the using statement, it doesn't actually know about the Microsoft namespace. So if you look at the dependencies in NuGet, you'll see that the library that got imported is Microsoft Entity Framework Core. But if I try to actually go using Microsoft dot, and you actually don't see the namespace here. For some strange reason, at this point in the NuGet package or Visual Studio, it doesn't refresh the actual references. So in order to get that to work, I have to go ahead and close Visual Studio and then go ahead and reopen that solution, and it will reinitialize the references, and you should be able to actually now see if I hover over this once it finishes loading the project. And I go ahead and click this light bulb icon here, you can see that now it sees the actual new library, and I can choose that, and it will actually initialize it. So now I have my context created. Now what we want to do is we actually want to create a database that we want to point this context to. And we're going to do that by opening up SQL Management Studio. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that option here. And you can see how we installed SQL Server 2016 Express Edition with Management Studio in a previous video. So if you'd like to look at that, you can go ahead and do that. And I'm going to go ahead and connect here. And under the databases, you'll see the test database that were created during the installation and validation process. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new database and call it contacts. And hit OK here. And I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new table that's going to represent the data that I want to be able to actually display in the application. So what we're going to do is basically a very simple table that shows you some first name, last name, birthday information about a person. So I'm going to go ahead and add a ID column, and we're going to give it a data type of big int. And since it's going to be a primary key, we don't want it to be a nullable field. We're going to give it a column first name and varchar of 100, so 100 characters, and it's not going to be nullable. Last name, again, and varchar of 100, and also not nullable, and birth date. Now in this case, it's going to be a date type column, and I do want to keep it nullable because sometimes you might not have the birthday information about a person, which in this case just shows you how we would go about allowing that scenario. And then the other thing we need to do is we actually want to set this as an actual identity column, and we're going to do that by right-clicking here and set it as a primary key, as well as under the specifications for identity, we're going to say yes for identity by double-clicking on this. We'll change it to yes. And this will also allow us to automatically increment the identity column on its own whenever we add new records. This is very handy, and it's a good practice to have auto-incrementing identity columns. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and I'm going to call it people. So now I have a table, if I refresh here, called dbo.people. In here, we'll open this up, and we're going to see that there's no information stored here yet because we didn't provide any information. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new record called Joe Smith and give it a birthday of January 1st of, let's say, 1975. I pressed enter, and it actually populates the rest of the value, which is basically 120000. So now we have a single record in a database that we can use for displaying on the actual application. So here, what we're also going to need to do is we're going to need to create a class that represents the data that we're going to be retrieving. So what we are going to want to do is create a new folder, and this is also good practice, where you're going to put all your classes that represent the objects that you're going to be pulling from a database, and we're going to add a new class here called person. In this person class, what we're going to want to do is define a set of properties that are going to be populated from a database, and then we're going to be able to use them to actually render the information on the screen. So what we're going to want to do is create a property called ID, and it's actually going to be a long, which is equals a big int, and then we're going to call it ID with a property getter and setter. We're going to then create the other properties. So string for first name, property string last name, property date time, and you'll notice I'm putting a question mark here. And this is a way to in C# to indicate a nullable field, and this is very useful because if we have a nullable value, or you want to be able to set a null in the database column value, that you can use this nullable field to actually indicate that. So now we have our class created, and what we're going to want to do is go back to our context, and we're going to want to actually create a property that represents that table within this context. And we do this by creating a new property called dbSet of type person. And by highlighting this here, I can just use the IntelliSense help from Visual Studio, and it automatically imports the namespace where that class lives, which is under the models namespace, and I can go ahead and save that. Now, another important thing to note, at least in this state of .NET Core, is if you try to actually use this from ASP.NET MVC Core, it will actually not work unless you add another constructor that allows it to this allows it to basically initiate correctly the SQL database provider. So what this is we have to actually specify a set of options, which is DB context options, and we're going to pass in the context options for this context. And the way you do that is by basically creating a constructor that passes in those options into the base class. So this is enough to actually make it work, and we can go ahead and close this class as we don't need it anymore. And now what we're going to want to do is we want to actually make this database project available to the main application, and we do this by actually adding a reference to the project by selecting add reference, and then under the project solution, so basically any project within the solution becomes available. I'm going to go ahead and select that here, hit OK. And now in order to make this work in terms of connecting the actual database and making it available for use to our ASP.NET MVC Core application, we have to actually tell it how to initialize the connection to the database. And you do this by instantiating a connection string, and in the later videos I'll show you how to actually use parameters from the application config file, but in this case we're just going to hardcode the connection string in this class here, and I'll show you the actual connection once the database connection establishes to render the data. So we're going to call this db connection, and for now we're just going to keep it blank. And here what we're going to do is we're going to call services.add_db context, and we're going to give it the context type that we're going to be using. So it's going to be the context, and I chose this light bulb again to point it to the namespace where this object exists. And one of the parameters it wants is the options parameter. So, and you do that by typing in options, use SQL Server. And you notice that there is no IntelliSense, and the reason for that is because we didn't actually import a namespace that contains that extension method. So, and I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to point it to this DB connection, and we're going to close this out. Now, as you notice that it has an underscore or the squiggly lines, and indicating that it doesn't know what this method is, and we'll fix that by adding a new using statement pointing to Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. So as soon as we do that, you can see that option actually became available. So if you go ahead and put a dot there again, you should be able to actually see that SQL Server is an extension method that is being added for this type of object class or object type. So this actually finishes the actual bootstrapping process to make this context available to things like the controllers where the data is going to be used from. Now what we want to do is we actually want to point to our database that we created, and we do that by specifying the connection string and pointing to a server. So in this case, since I'm running on the same machine, I can point it to local, which is basically the same server that this application is running on. And then what we're going to want to do is specify the database, which is contacts. And then we also are going to specify how we want to authenticate to it. And we're going to use what's called a trusted connection, which is basically using the same credentials that I'm executing this application under to be able to actually connect to the SQL Server. So we're going to say trusted underscore connection equals true. And this should be enough to actually allow that connection to happen to the database. So the bootstrapping process of this context has been completed, and we can go ahead and close this up. And the next step is we're going to want to actually set up our controller to be able to have a reference to this new database context. And we do this by creating a new constructor for this controller, as one by default is not created. And what we're going to do is we're going to specify the context for the database that we're going to want to use, and it's context, and we're going to just call it DB. And as you can see, it doesn't know because we don't have a namespace, so I'm going to go ahead and use that IntelliSense helper again, pointed to the right object. And here what I typically like to do is actually I'll create a private property that's only accessible by this controller. This way others that could instantiate the home controller can't use it, and it's a good practice to have to create less dependencies between your controllers. So what I'll do is I'll create a new property that is a private property and just call it DB with a getter and a setter, and I will populate it in the constructor. And a good reason for me doing this is actually this way I don't have to store it as a private variable if I want to be able to change some settings later on, and I have a bunch of places where I need to reference this object and I need to do something before it or after it, such as logging. I can do this by simply changing this database getter or a setter and actually handle the logic here without ever having to go back to other methods where this database object was being passed to and having to change all of this implementation. So this makes it a little bit more future proof. So now, since I have this property set, I should be able to access it anywhere within this instance of the request within any of these actions. So what I'm going to show you real quick is I'm going to just simply return the table information from the people table and pass it back to the index view. So I'm going to modify this index action to return the db.people and you can let's see, it's actually not compiled, so I'm going to go ahead and rebuild this. And that's because I didn't give it a name. So, so let's actually call it people, and we should be able to actually reference it without any problems now. So, simple mistakes in naming cause these kind of problems. So now that we've named it correctly, I can go ahead and compile the solution, and everything looks good so far. Now everything is ready for me to actually be able to display the information. Now we didn't actually do anything to get that information rendered on the screen yet. So, and what we're going to do is, in this application we have the home controller, which we're in right here, and the views that represent the information that the home controller can provide are under the views home folder. And you can see that we have an index action, about action, contact action, and each one of them have their own view. So since we're modifying the index action, I'm going to go ahead and open up the index.cs HTML, and this is the screen that actually represents the data that we're going to want to render. Now if you launch this application right now, what you'll notice is, if everything works okay, you'll notice the default application index page. And here, since this is a starting project, Microsoft has put in some basic information about what you might want to do, such as logging, adding NuGet packages, etc. Now, we don't actually need this to display anything about the table that we're trying to pull down and render on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this content and just render the information that's coming from a database. So in order to do that, close the browser, and I'm going to go ahead and clean this up by simply deleting all of this content here. And before we get started, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to declare for this given view the data type for the model that we're going to be wanting to render. So in this case, this is done by doing the @ symbol and declaring the model, and then giving it the type of an object that we would expect to get. And since I'm only showing you how to display a list of people records that are coming back, I can go ahead and just declare a model that represents an IEnumerable, or basically a list of people objects. And you do this by using an interface that's called the IEnumerable, and we're going to point it to the actual model that we're going to be actually rendering. So, and it exists within the contacts.db project, and underneath that project there's a namespace called model, and the actual object type is going to be person. So now anytime that we reference a model property within this view, it is going to assume that the model is of type IEnumerable, and you can go ahead and just basically iterate over the list. Now in the future videos, I'll actually show you how do you change from being able to render the model that comes out of the database directly, and to have a view for them, or should I say the model for the given view that you're rendering, because sometimes you might want to actually display information such as, you know, the title of a page, and you want that to be part of the view. Or sometimes you might want to pass in some additional settings that are not part of the database itself, or particularly not in that table that you're rendering. So you might have information coming from many different sources, but you want to represent it within the model that's being passed back to this view to render. So, and there's a best practice to actually do that, but for now we don't need that. And so what I'll show you is how to simply render this list for now. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a quick div that is going to allow us to actually create what's called a row, as well as a column to start rendering the information. So since we're using Bootstrap CSS here, there's a class called row, and this allows us to actually start creating separation between the different data elements. And then within that, I'm going to create another div class that is going to be called call MD-10. So this is, again, in future videos we might discuss the topic about using Bootstrap and what all these different classes mean and how to leverage them best to create a layout for your application. But for the purpose of this video, the big quick summary of it is we're going to have a row that has a column where it displays information, so it needs to be wide enough, and in this case I'm specifying a column medium width of 10 specifically, and it has a representation in terms of how many pixels wide do you want your column to be. So now what we're going to want to do is, since we have that list of people we want to render in our model, we're going to want to iterate over that list, and you do this by specifying at for each var person in model. Now, as I said before, since we've already declared what the data type for our model is, the view already knows, and we can go ahead and start actually iterating over that. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create an HTML element called unordered list, and we're going to put it around the for each, and within the for each we're going to generate a list of list items within that unordered list. And you do this by creating an li element, and basically what we're going to output is the first name, last name, as well as the birth date for that person. So, and we're going to make the actual headers bold, and we'll do that by creating a bold tag, and we're going to just do first name colon space at, which will indicate being able to use the person class, and we'll do person.first name, and we're gonna then specify a space, another bold tag for last name, colon, space at person last name, another space, and we're gonna do another bold tag with birth date, with a semicolon, with a colon, and at person.birthdate. So if everything went well and we run this application, what we should be able to see now is actually the list of people that are stored in our database. So I'm going to go ahead and run this by clicking F5. And as you can see, we have our record displayed here. So first name Joe, last name Smith, with the birth date that we specified. Now let's see if we add another record to see if everything works well. So we're going to create a new record called John Doe, and we're going to give it a birth date of 1950. Basically, let's say 2/5/1950, and it's going to be, let's say, 06/35/00. So if we go back to our application here and hit refresh, you can see that John Doe was born on February 5th, 1950 at 6:35 a.m. So, and as you delete records here and go back and refresh, the information is gone. So basically, this is pretty much it. You have now the ability to actually display the information about the records you have in your database. And if you want to add additional tables, you would basically go through a similar exercise where you would create a new table. You can create relationships between them, and then you can create in your solution a set of views and controllers that allow you to actually render the information from a database And also in later videos we can discuss about how do you create views that allow you to create and modify records directly from an application, so you can actually make it usable and the consumer doesn't have to go into a database to make those changes. So hopefully this was a good introduction of how do you connect from your ASP.NET Core MVC application to SQL Database backend using Entity Framework Core to get you started. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below the video. And I will get back to you as quickly as I can. And if you have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to provide those comments as well. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time.